I have two camping/hiking experiences that I consider scary. The first was when hiking the West Highland Way in Scotland. After a hard day's hiking, I realized I wouldn't reach my campsite before nightfall. Rather than stopping and pitching my tent for the night, I decided to continue in the dark. All was going well. The paths were easy to follow by moonlight. Then I got a strange feeling. I couldn't put my finger on it, but something was there. Something was watching me. As I scrambled in my backpack for my torch, I turned and was confronted by a pair of eyes reflecting the moonlight. These eyes were at equal level to mine, so something 6 foot tall was staring at me. I was shaking as my hand found my torch, and I quickly turned it on and aimed the beam at the eyes. In an instant, my heart rate dropped back to normal. The eyes belonged to a sheep, who was standing on a large rock, making it appear larger than it actually was. My second incident occurred whilst hiking the Appalachian Trail in the United States. I had started my hike earlier in the year, actually too early, and I was battling the cold and snow. I had spent the morning hiking up the mountain, following the flashes indicating the path. Those mountains never seemed to end, and after hour of ascending, I finally reached the summit. I stopped, cooked lunch, and took a few pictures of the stunning views. I then decided to start my downward descent, but I couldn't see a flash. Where was the path? There were a number of unmarked paths heading through the undergrowth, and I decided to follow one. This path went for about half a mile before suddenly ending at a sheer drop. I decided to take a few more pictures when I heard twigs break behind me. I assumed it was another lost hiker and didn't pay much attention. Then I heard grunting, which wasn't normal hiking sounds, so I turned around to find a bear standing on its hind legs around 6 feet from me. I then realized I must have disturbed him as he was waking from hibernation, and I had just cooked and was carrying food. I must have smelt like a walking takeaway buffet. He charged at the exact same time as I stepped back over the top of the sheer drop. As I started to fall, I felt his claw strike my leg. I fell about 30 feet, landing in a heap, intact apart from the pain in my ankle and a big gash on my calf. I was alone miles from anywhere with an injured ankle and a gashed calf, and somewhere nearby was a bear. I could see a road in the distance amongst the trees, and I had no option but to head in that direction. I finally reached the road and a clearing as it just started to snow again, and I realized I could go no further. I pitched my tent and climbed inside. Early the next morning, I heard something outside and with trepidation poked my head outside, expecting to meet my furry foe. I was, however, confronted by someone walking their dog. After greetings were exchanged, he pointed out a sign that I had missed the previous day. It was a park ranger announcement that bears were active in the area. The dog walker then gave me a lift into town where I could get my ankle and calf treated. I had fractured my ankle, which unfortunately ended my hike. I still to this day have a nice claw-shaped scar along my calf. Before we were married, my husband was camping alone. He had driven up north near Bancroft and took a fire access road from the main highway to find a secluded spot near a lake. He was all set up and ready to go to bed in his tent and decided to read by lantern light. His lime green tent would have had a strange glow in the darkness of the night. It was an isolated spot with no cottages for quite a distance. Where he had set up was an open area with scrub brush and some trees. Aside from the shoreline, he was surrounded beyond that by forest. As he read, he became aware of a full gallop of hooves. He quickly shut off the light and the galloping stopped. After a few minutes, he switched the light back on and the running hooves started up again, full tilt in his direction. Again, he quickly shut off the light. He waited a longer period in the complete darkness, hearing nothing. Finally, he turned the light back on, and sure enough, the hooves could be heard coming again his way, and now they were way too close for comfort. He quickly fumbled for the light switch and the galloping stopped dead in its tracks. He could hear nothing and waited for several minutes in the pitch dark. He decided there was nothing to do but try and get some sleep. He had no intention of leaving the safety of his tent to confront whatever it was that was out there. It seemed to be waiting as there was no sound of retreat. It was a restless night for him. In the light of the morning, he cautiously opened his tent to find everything as he left it. There was no sign of his night visitor. He concluded it must have been a moose. They can be ornery, and the eerie glow of the tent might have sent it charging at him. He told me when he was a kid his family used to camp very far north, much further north than Bancroft, sometimes a 9-hour trip to get there. A fire ranger had come through their campsite one day, and his mom had asked if there were bears in the vicinity. If you are responsible and keep your food and trash secured and not accessible, you don't really need to worry about bears as they tend to avoid people. He never forgot what the ranger had said. "Ma'am, it's not the bears you have to worry about. It's the moose. If they are in rutting season, they are very unpredictable." His thin polyester tent would have been useless to protect him. It was a close call. It was one cold, dark night on an island where I like to go deer hunting. I climbed down from my stand at about 5:30 p.m. after a 6-hour sit. It was getting pretty dark and I wasn't holding back on my pace as I had to paddle back to the boat launch, which was a good country mile from the island. This island is pretty large, roughly 9 square miles, and I was a good 2 miles away from my canoe. As I start walking, the night approaches and I turn my headlamp on and keep walking. About 10 minutes into my trek back, I start hearing leaves being stepped on from my 5 and 6 o'clock, and I didn't really think much of it, because it is the woods. I keep walking, and I continually hear leaves cracking behind me, about 30 yards back. Then I start hearing a series of panting and yelping. And oh shit, I realized I'm being surrounded by coyotes. Now, this wouldn't have been a problem if it were 3 of them, but a solid pack was trying to make their move on me. At this point, I unshouldered my sporterized Lee Enfield and loaded an extra 4 rounds of that sweet .303 British. I also checked for my Mora. The next thing I know, I see a coyote about 15 yards in front of me cross the edge of my beam from my headlamp. And this thing was pretty big. And 150-pound Damon was kinda shook. As soon as it crossed, I shouldered my rifle and sent a round into the coyote's inner shoulder, and it dropped like a sack of shit. I heard running to my rear and I turned around. The thing stopped dead like a deer in headlights. I shot it dead, turned around, and decided if I stayed, I'd probably be turned into a drumstick. So my high school XC varsity came into play, and at this point, I was about 100 yards away from my boat, so I sprinted to the canoe. The coyotes seemed to signal each other and caught me. One tried to bite my shoe, but I shook him off. I made it to the bank where I jumped into my canoe and pushed it off into the water and looked back. I saw no coyotes, but I heard them yelping. I began to collect myself, checking myself for bite marks. Nope, all good. So I go to unload my rifle. I reached for the mag release. I try for the magazine. Nada. It's not there. I had 1 round left of .303 in the chamber. Needless to say, I don't go hunt on that island anymore. The next day I went back in the afternoon with my .223 to try to find my magazine. In my search I found one of the coyotes, and it was nothing but scattered bones and fur. I found my magazine and was on my merry way. I usually camp in the mountains behind where I live, either in the forest or more usually up above the tree line, always with 1 or more friends. The one I go with most is slightly paranoid about night noises. If I can rationalize it away, hedgehog, deer, whatever, then I can sleep through it. But he freaks out, convinced that an acorn we heard fall is in fact a deranged serial killer. So he switches on the light and starts shouting that we have a machete. In actual honest terms, the scariest thing I ever experienced whilst camping was a family of wild boar that were attracted to the food while we slept. We woke up to high-pitched squeals and grunts and one very low and loud grunt. We made lots of noise and heard them take off through the brush, but they kept coming back. We were afraid that if we let them get close enough and then startled them, the mother would decide we were too close and would charge. For reference, an adult boar is around 50 through 60 kilograms of angry, bulletproof, tusk-wielding rage. We ended up packing up in the middle of the night and hightailing it down the mountain in the dark. Every twig snap and rustling bush freaked us out because we were genuinely scared that we would run into another boar. Towards the end of '95, our eldest daughter had a visitor from a Canadian friend, whom she met in kibbutz in Israel. My husband and I both worked for factories which were closed over the December holidays, so we decided to take the visitor on a tour of southern Africa. Our youngest daughter, who had her own business at the time, decided to join us. We set off in our Renault, towing a trailer containing our 2-room tent and all we would need for 2 weeks camping. Things went well until we arrived at Lagos in the Western Cape. The camping ground was rocky with not a tree in sight. The view was wild and desolate with no other campers. We were completely on our own. We went for a walk along the lonely shore, but soon turned back because of the blowing sand. Upon trying to pitch the tent, it was discovered that below the pebbled surface was an impenetrable layer of rocks. The tent pegs could only penetrate about 4 inches. After many bent tent pegs and much cussing, we decided to hope for the best. During the night, the wind picked up and the rain blew in. The wind was so strong that the tent pegs were pulled out and the tent started collapsing. We had to do something. All we could do was tie the tent to the car and the trailer in an effort to not have the tent blow away. The wind was so strong. It was really scary. We managed to doze off again, all soggy around the edges until daylight. We broke camp as soon as possible, still battling the wind. At least the rain had blown away. That was the scariest and most uncomfortable night the 5 of us ever experienced on that otherwise wonderful trip. After my freshman year in college, I decided to tour the U.S. I went with a college friend. We'll call him Will. Will and I saw friends in Dallas, the Grand Canyon, got kicked out of 3 casinos in Las Vegas for being underage, camped on Mount Whitney, and finally arrived in Yosemite. Yosemite was beautiful, but there was no room to camp in the valley, so we bought some junk food and headed back up into the mountains to find a place to camp. We found it well off the main road, right beside a beautiful lake with no other campers in sight. We even had to wade a nice stream to get to it. Loving to fish, I caught a few trout, we ate dinner, and decided to call it a day. By this time, Will and I were suffering from far too much togetherness, so I decided to avoid our cramped tent and slept under the stars. Sometime after midnight, there was a loud crash. Will yelled, "What was that?" It was obviously a bear raiding our breakfast, so I whispered. He knocked it over. The bear went silent. Will then loudly called out, "Who knocked what over?" I whispered, "The bear." I never heard one more word out of Will's mouth the rest of the night. I was so tired I went back to sleep, but woke up an hour later and saw this very large bear washing himself off under the moonlight in the lake. Again, back to sleep. It wasn't until the next morning when I looked at all of the frying pan-sized paw prints circling my sleeping bag, the giant holes in our cooler from his claws, and the gashes on my fly rod handle from the smell of fish, that I began to wonder why I hadn't been scared. Admittedly, I was very tired. These are more of some grounded, scary experiences off in the woods as opposed to someone looking at someone creepy-like. I figured I'd give these a go and see what people think, plus it's nice to have a nice little change of completely real things that might seem mundane to a lot of people, but once you're out there and alone, it's a bit of a different story. Regardless, I hope you enjoyed them, and if you didn't, make sure you tell me down in the comments, and if you did, make sure you tell me down in the comments. I hope everyone has a great day. I will catch you all in the next video. And just remember, it's always scarier if it's true. Bad bye. This is a story that takes place at my uncle's cabin. It's located about 30 miles out of the closest city, pretty much the middle of nowhere. We ended up taking a 4-day weekend and going out there. 2 days into our trip, we started noticing someone was around the area. Originally, we would just find things out of place and thought one of us was messing with the other, but we started to hear footsteps and voices. I asked my uncle if he heard anything, and he just replied, "They're turning the frogs gay." I asked him what that had to do with anything about the people out here, and he just responded, "They're harvesting babies." My uncle being my uncle. So I decided to go out and investigate alone. I decided to take my slingshot over my 12 gauge. I figured I'm a better shot with a slingshot, so if anyone was out there and they came after me, I could just shoot them in the eye with the thing or something. That was probably my first mistake. Actually, my first mistake was going to a cabin with my uncle, because for the whole goddamn ride, all I heard about was how the frogs were turning gay and how they're harvesting babies. I don't even know who the fuck they are, but they're doing it, I guess, at least according to him. But I digress. I'd say I made it about 300 yards into the woods before I started hearing voices. I decided I needed to sneak up on these people and find out what they were doing out there. So I started to low crawl up to them, being very vigilant to make sure I didn't break any branches. As I'm making my way up towards them, out of nowhere, a mountain lion comes in. He starts licking me, and I say, "Get away, mountain lion, I'm listening to these people." After realizing the mountain lion wasn't going anywhere, I decided to just deal with it. I sat there and listened to these two men discussing something. "Hey man, did you put that stuff in the water to turn the frogs gay?" "Yeah dude, I got it. Don't even worry about it, we got those frogs, they're gonna be real gay, dude." "Awesome. Now what about some babies? We gotta find them to harvest them." "Hey, don't worry dude, I got you covered there too. We'll head out tomorrow and we'll go get ourselves some babies to harvest." This was the point I realized that I'd heard enough. I pulled a stone out of my pocket and loaded it into my slingshot. I pulled it back and lined up the shot, and let it go. Turns out I'm a horrible shot with a slingshot. I didn't even get close to him. But it turns out they actually heard the noise and went to follow, and fortunately I had shot it away from me because I'm not that bad of a shot to where I shot it at myself, so that put a lot of distance between them and me. So I took that opportunity to get up and run as fast as I could back to my uncle's cabin. As soon as I'm walking up the stairs, I hear him yell, "They're turning the frogs gay!" I burst through the door and say, "You're right, Uncle. They're turning the frogs gay and they're harvesting babies. What do we do?" He stands up and looks at me and a smile creeps across his face. "We're gonna go find some really pretty frogs and bring them and turn these frogs back to being straight. And then we're gonna go protect all these babies from being harvested." I told him that sounded like a great idea, but we should finish the weekend first. And that's what we did. We played Jenga the rest of the weekend, and my uncle informed me about all the other stuff that he found out there doing. Way too much to get into here, but I'll let you know, holy shit, they are busy. so I'll keep you all updated on if we're turning the frog straight or not. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed that last story, then you have some issues because I didn't even enjoy it. But then again, I'm not listening to it. They never sound funny while I'm recording it. It's usually after that I start laughing. But I also usually have some help laughing. Yeah. So, thanks for sticking around, and I hope you have a wonderful day, and, yeah, hopefully you enjoyed this video. And if not, whoops, my bad.